What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel. And I am Thrash Maniac 99, back at it with yet another discography ranking. We are concluding 2024 as far as discography rankings with a bang. And that is going to be for none other than Norwegian black metal legends, Immortal. So yeah, this is a ranking that's been a long time coming for sure, since, a lot of metalheads love Immortal, and I love Immortal too. And I figured, with it being wintertime, it was appropriate to talk about the kings of winter, you could call them, to a certain extent. So, yeah, I was pretty excited to do the Immortal ranking, and, well, here we are. So, as far as how I got into Immortal, I kind of got into Immortal a little bit late, as I did with quite a few bands I've done discography rankings for this year. I got into Immortal rather late. Probably the first album that I was really aware of as far as like upcoming releases for Immortal was Northern Chaos Gods when it came out in 2018. Of course, I'd listened to songs in the past like Call of the Winter Moon, Tyrants, One on One, songs like that I definitely heard in passing and loved those songs. But it wasn't until Northern Chaos Gods where I started paying more attention to Immortal and then gradually getting all their albums, and then really never gave the whole discography a shot until doing this ranking, just like I've done with a lot of rankings this year. So, yeah, because again, when it came down to me in black metal, it's been a gradual gateway for me, so yeah, that's just kind of more or less how I got into Immortal. And then, of course, Abath. I mean, he's one of the biggest spirit animals in metal, and we hope he never dies. But without further ado, let's get into the history of Immortal. So Immortal formed in Bergen, Norway in 1991 out of the ashes of two obscure death metal bands from Norway, Amputation, but more famously, Old Funeral. Both bands had the following members: Olive Ekimo, otherwise better known as Abath, who is the bassist and vocalist, and then guitarist Harald Navdal, otherwise better known as Demonos, on guitars. So these two were the best of friends out of those two bands, and when those two bands ended up dissolving, they wanted to do something different, because around 1991 was when black metal in Norway was starting to become a revolution, with some of their peers like Mayhem and Emperor and Satyricon, and even later on Dark Throne. So, yeah, Immortal decided to kind of play catch-up with what was happening in Norway, so they decided to drop their proper death metal sound and into more of a black metal band, but still retaining death metal. Like, there's still, across the board on this entire discography, there's still some death metal riffs that come in Immortal's music. So they didn't totally abandon it, they just went for more of a black metal thing. And thus Immortal was born, and then they would recruit drummer Gerard Herfindahl, otherwise known as Armageddon, to be their drummer in their early career. So, through doing some little gigs as well as getting demos made, they ended up getting signed to Osmos Productions, which was a French label that was really pumping out a lot of big underground metal releases during the 90s. And so they would enter the studio in 1992, and this would be the first of 3 albums produced or worked on by the legendary Heinrich Hudvend, otherwise known as Python, who I've mentioned in the past on discography rankings. Like, I think I mentioned him in Mayhem and Enslaved, because the guy, he was kind of like the Scott Burns of Norway. When it came down to, like, a lot of bands went to Python to get this nasty, raw, cold sound out of their music. So they would record with Python, and released July 1st, 1992, we get their debut album, Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism. This is my number 5. I think this is an awesome debut for Immortal because, well, it's definitely one of the more raw sounding albums, but not the rawest. That'll come on the next album, arguably. But yeah, raw beginnings for Immortal, and this would be the only album to feature Armageddon on drums. And holy shit, like top to bottom, it's only, if you don't count the intro, it's only 6 tracks, but holy crap, all these songs are just awesome. Definitely picking up from where bands like Bathory left off with some of these riff ideas and speed changes and a lot of cool moments that just make you think of early black metal, like first wave black metal, like Bathory and so on and so forth. Of course, The Call of the Winter Moon, it's one of their most famous songs, and of course, the over-the-top music video, which was lo-fi, corny, and cheesy, but who gives a shit? It was awesome, with Armageddon, or I think it was a different drummer at the time, wearing a wizard's hat and frickin' cape. It was pretty cool. But the song itself, catchy riffs, lots of blasting, even some doomy parts show up. Unholy Forces of Evil, like awesome death metal triplet chugs, murky gallops, like just everything Immortal is all about wrapped up into that song. Cryptic Winter Storms gets a little folky at times with some acoustic play, but it does swing and chug similar to Bathory. And then the closer, A Perfect Vision of the Rising Northland, kind of a precursor to what they would become over the course of the next several albums, where it's a little more melodic. There's even a nice solo on there. It's swinging. There's some really tasteful folky acoustics. Like, again, just everything you know and love about Immortal begins with this album. So even the track Blacker Than Darkness, very thrashy, which is also a bit of a wink wink nudge nudge towards a sound change later on in their career. But yeah, awesome debut album, and it was my number 5. So as they continue on, they actually would start touring across Europe, doing some festival shows, and then they would return to the studio over a year later in 1993, once again working with Python, and released November 1st, 1993, we would get Pure Holocaust. This is my number 4. I think songwriting-wise, got a little bit better than the debut, even though production-wise, it's much more raw. In fact, I would say it's easily the most raw-sounding Immortal album in their entire catalog. Like, the guitars feel very gainy and kind of squawky at times, but it kind of works for the time. 1993 was really where the Norwegian scene was starting to explode, not only in terms of musical popularity, but because of the crimes that was going on in the scene. Thankfully, though, Immortal was not a part of that and never attacked religion at all. In fact, pretty much all their lyrics are based on a fantasy world called Blashurk, which that name's going to be brought up quite a bit in this video because they use that a lot in their titles and lyrics, and so on and so forth. So it's all fantastical, but based around winter. For this album, actually for this and the next album, Abbott is actually doing the drums, and I gotta say, he's a very underrated drummer. I think Abbott doesn't quite get enough credit for being an excellent musician, not just a vocalist, but also just great musicianship. He can play guitar, he can play bass, and from this and the next album, hell of a drummer too. And also, Abba's vocals start to kind of sound more like his signature, like, croaking frog vocals, which I can't do. So this was really the beginning of that particular vocal sound for Abbott, because on the debut, sounded more like straightforward black metal, which was perfect for him, but here is really where you kind of get a sense of his own identity. Of course, the guitars definitely feel like death metal tight in terms of like how gnarly the riffs get. Like Unsilent Storms in the North Abyss, it's a much more aggressive song for Immortal at this point. It's very evil sounding, and there's even some like dissonant tremolos going on here. Like, and also this is where more of the black metal tropes really shine through. Like, you get some of that on the debut, but it was more like first wave black metal. This feels a lot closer to the contemporary black metal scene of the time. The Sun No Longer Rises, that's another one of Immortal's signature songs. As the Eternity Opens, man, it's just nasty and furious the whole way through. And the title track, just riffs on riffs on riffs and gallops upon gallops, just awesome shit. And you'll notice pretty much throughout the entire discography, Immortal does a great job at making sure their title tracks were great. Like, you'll hear me say it on every album, the title track. Oh, the title track. Oh yeah, the title track. And blah, 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 blah. But yeah, Pure Holocaust, my number 4. So we move forward, actually a little bit longer. We fast forward over a year and a half later. So Immortal's starting to really get their name out there. And they would return to the studio at the very end of 1994, heading into 1995. Once again, Python helping out in production, only this time he's engineering, while Demon Oz and Abath were doing the production itself. And released May 15th, 1995, we get Battles in the North. This is my number 3. So yeah, it's like, as Immortal continues on here in this early run, they just get better and better with their songwriting and incorporating more melodies. In fact, this returns to more epic melodies that you kind of got on the debut, not as much on Pure Holocaust, whereas here, you know, the signature Immortal epic melodies really start to shine. Also, I love the guitar tone on this album. Grittier, doesn't sound as gainy and squawky as Pure Holocaust did. And this album, more songs, but all these songs are shorter, but they're very impactful. Once again, Abath showcasing his underrated drum ability. The title track, awesome death metal triplet chugs and tremolo riffs galore. Cursed Realms of the Winter Demons. This is really where the melodic riffage really shines through. There's even some cool double time patterns. It gets thrashy. Throned by Black Storms. Awesome triplet chugs once again, and lots of great blast beats. But the big song off of this album, and it still remains one of their most famous songs and another great famous music video, Blashherk Mighty Raven Dark. Awesome, like, triplet stomps and marching, but with great melodies and riffs all throughout. And of course, that one moment in the music video where after the synth passage, you see Abath run over to another hill of a mountain while Demon Oz is shredding the solo at the end, which kind of a funny little moment. Like, I was like, oh shit, I need to be over here for this next part. Run! But yeah, silliness is always a guarantee when it comes to Abath. But yeah, the song itself, an amazing closer, and it remains one of the band's best songs they ever made. The album as a whole, again, just gradual improvements in their early run, and that's why it wound up as my number 3. So we fast forward once again. This time we fast forward yet again another almost year and a half. At the end of 1996, they would return to the studio, and this time they would actually finally get a drummer. They would get the one and only Horg, and he would later on go on to play for Hypocrisy as well. So there would be a long period of time where Horg would end up being in both bands at the same time. But yeah, Horg comes in on drums. And for this next album, they would actually change up producers. They would get Henrique Helland to be the producer, and released February 24th, 1997, we get Blizzard Beasts. Now, I will say when it came to this ranking, there was no bad album. In fact, I will say I think every Immortal album's really good to outstanding. Something had to come in last place, and it was this. And I'll talk about why it's last place here in a minute, but I will say this is their shortest album at just under 29 minutes, and this is really where a lot of their death metal influence really shines. And I'm talking particularly Morbid Angel. Like, Immortal were huge fans of Morbid Angel, and it definitely shines on this album. The title track, Blizzard Beasts, just furious blasting and double time. Suns that sank below. This is awesome, like death metal riffs and thrashy double time, but with that cold black metal atmosphere. Battlefields, definitely direct Morbid Angel influence with the riffs, but it also feels like a precursor to a song that would come years later. And then Mountains of Might, tasty synths, but you still get more of those death metal riffs, but great black metal tremolo melodies, clean melodies, and gallops. Yeah, like most of these songs, like I said, were really short, like barely at 3 minutes, but they were able to pack a punch in all these songs. Now, and then of course this would be the final album with Demon Oz on guitars for 21 years after he got diagnosed with acute tendonitis, not long after this album came out. But I originally had this album higher on my list, but it wound up last, and it's principally because of one thing: the production. The guitar tone, I love the guitar tone on here. It sounds a bit beefier, but it's still gritty and raw. It's definitely death metal, like early death metal inspired guitar tone, as well as with the riffs. But the problem with the production, it comes down to the drums. The drums sound small and thin. I don't know what Henrique was trying to do with the drums, but she really screwed the pooch. She really screwed the pooch when it came to the drums, because Horg puts on a fantastic performance, but you can barely hear what he's doing because the drums were mixed so bad, and even the recording quality of the drums wasn't good either. So I feel like if the drums would have been re-recorded with a better tone and a better mix, I think it would have put this album back up higher on my list where I had it originally. But because of the drums being the way they are, that's why this album ended up as my last place. So we move forward once again. We would move on into 1999. So 2 years go by, and this would begin a big relationship going forward for the most of the rest of the catalog. They would go over to Sweden, over to the legendary Abyss studio, to work with one Peter Tattergren from Hypocrisy, and Peter would be their producer for the next several albums because Immortal really, really like him. And of course, through this partnership was when Horg eventually joined Hypocrisy. But they would go to Peter at the end of 1998 to work on this next album, and released February 22nd, 1999, we would get At the Heart of Winter. Going into this ranking, this was originally lower on my list. I guess I shouldn't say lower. It was one spot lower on the list, but coming out of this ranking, this ended up being my number one. Holy shit, this is a masterpiece of black metal, and also kind of signaling a bit of a shift in their sound again, whereas Blizzard Beasts was definitely a shift into a little bit of death metal. Here, sounds like a shift into both more epic stuff as well as more melody, but also thrash. Like, there's some thrashy moments that show up on here across the board. Demon Oz, I forgot to mention, would still remain in the band. However, he wouldn't be able to play guitar for a long time, so he remained as the band's lyricist. So he would be still there writing lyrics. Abath taking over guitar duties as well as playing bass and doing vocals while Org handles the drums. But yeah, this album, yeah, like I said, it's more epic, it's more melodic, there's more solos going on. And I mean, the opening track, Withstand the Fall of Time, that's another one of the signature songs in Immortal's catalog. Just great melodies, riffs, awesome double time. Solar Fall. This song has a lot of classic heavy metal moments on here with the chugs and the gallops. Tragedies, Blows at Horizon. gallops and swings, but once again you get some like tasty, clean melodies on the guitars. And then the title track basically is like an all-encompassing song on the album, but you get some more synths, and it feels a lot like a black metal equivalent to Iron Maiden. Like these gallops, these melodic riffs, definitely sound like they were channeling Iron Maiden in their blackened hearts. But yeah, this album, top to bottom, it's, I would say, one of the best black metal albums, not only of the 90s, but perhaps of all time, because, you know, it's basically everything Immortal was all about, or were up to this point, and what they would eventually become going forward. So yeah, my number one, At the Heart of Winter. So we continue on throughout the rest of the 90s, heading into 2000. Actually, they would get right back to the studio at the end of 1999, almost such that it's like Peter almost didn't change settings. He eventually did change settings on the mixing board, but they would go back to the studio at the very end of 1999. Once again, Peter Tägtgren as producer, and this would be the only album to fully feature bassist Stian Smorholm, otherwise known as Iskaria, on bass. And released March 27th, 2000, we get Damned in Black. This is another one I actually originally had lower on the list, but after listening to it, this went up to my number 7. Yeah, it is a drop-off from At the Heart of Winter, but I will say this is perhaps the most underrated Immortal album, in my personal opinion. I don't get why this album gets a lot of flack. Like, you go onto the archives, it's got the lowest percentage average review rating. I don't get why. I think this is an awesome album. Definitely, again, signaling another shift in their sound. Again, even more thrash metal influence shows up, and it's heavier, too. Like, I will say this is a little bit heavier than At the Heart of Winter. It does miss the big melodies and the epicness of At the Heart of Winter, but we get a pretty good trade-off on it with a heavier tone and more thrash influence and more energy behind it. The song Triumph, still retaining a little bit of their death metal influence, but it's still very thrashy and into classic Immortal. Wrath from Above, this is truly like blackened thrash, almost like early Sodom, in my opinion. Against the Tide, awesome chugs, even a breakdown. I think one of the only times in Immortal's catalog, I would say, that there was like a breakdown in one of their songs. But the title track, Damned in Black, I will say this song kind of feels a lot closer to At the Heart of Winter. It's just got a little more chug, but it does sound like a continuation from where they left off on At the Heart of Winter in terms of the songwriting and the melodies, even some clean melodies, but it does have a little more chunk and chug to it, which I certainly appreciate. So yeah, in my opinion, most underrated album of their career, Damned in Black, my number 7. So, Damned in Black would end up being their final release on Osmos Productions, because not long after Damned in Black came out, they would get picked up by Nuclear Blast Records, where they still remain to this day, and they would get back to the studio in the middle towards the end of 2001, and this album would be another somewhat big shift in their sound, and released February 4th, 2002, we get Sons of Northern Darkness. This ended up being my number 2. This is a fantastic album. It's definitely one of the heaviest Immortal albums. It's definitely still in that, like, black metal meets thrash metal terrain, but the death metal elements come back a little more on this album. Also, it's somehow more melodic than usual. Like, it's much more melodic than Damned in Black, but I would argue at times it's heavier than Damned in Black. And it's also the longest album of their career at 50 minutes, so yeah, they definitely wanted to get more into songwriting on here. And of course, the top 3 tracks, the opening 3 tracks, One by One, the title track, and Tyrants, awesome 1, 2, 3 punch to really get this album going. One by One death metal chaos with that cold atmosphere, but awesome triplet chugs and gallops. The title track is like pure thrashy, Immortal. Tyrants, that's another one of the biggest staples in Immortal's career. It's groovy, it's riffy, some really nice, tasty, clean melodies. And then the closer, Beyond the North Waves, one of the longer songs on the album. It's like you notice the first half of the album's fairly short, and then the second half is like the songs get gradually longer and longer as they're experimenting a little more with songwriting. This song definitely goes for more of like a slower, almost doomy feel. Even some atonal riffs come in here, which is not something I'm used to saying when it comes down to Immortal songs. But top to bottom, awesome album, killer shit on here. What more could you want? This is my number 2. So, after Sons of Northern Darkness came out, unfortunately in 2003, the band would break up or just go on hiatus, mostly due to everybody having some personal stuff going on, so they took time away. Horg, I think this was also around the same time Horg, the drummer, would eventually join Hypocrisy, so he would become pretty busy with them. However, they would reunite in 2006. This time, they would have Apollyon from Art Noir, great black and thrash band from Norway, to come in to be the new bassist. And then around 2009, they decide to go back to the studio to work on a new album. Once again, Peter Tägtgren as the producer, and released September 25th, 2009, we get All Shall Fall. This one definitely falls for me. This is my number 9, so it's second to last. It's still a really, really good album. It's definitely, you could say, their most melodic album of their entire career. However, that's kind of a reason why this album fell, is because while it's still heavy, it lacks more heaviness in comparison to the melody. I think this album's like maybe 55% melodic, 45% heavy, which, nothing wrong with being more melodic, but I missed that heft that they had on the albums previous. So yeah, this album was missing the heft. But still some great songs on here, like the title track, All Shall Fall. It's melodic, riffy, some folky, clean guitars, and it definitely sounds a bit like a continuation from where they were on Sons of Northern Darkness. Hordes of War, this is definitely one of the heavier songs on the album. It's thrashy to the fucking bone. Excuse me. Norden on Fire, this is one of the more melodic songs that I actually really, really liked. It's like a melodic march, great guitar solos. In fact, this album has more emphasis on leads than most. And then Unearthly Kingdom, it's like a big mid-tempo melodic stomper. That was pretty cool. But yeah, I wish the album could have been more heavier, and I think if there was some more heavier parts that stood out more, this album would have gone up a little bit higher. I don't think it would have gone up much higher, but still, it was a really good album for what it was, and it was their first one in 7 years, so there is that factor. But yeah, it wound up being my number 9. So, over the next several years, the band would be touring, playing festivals, all sorts of stuff for a long time, and then we hit 2015, where there became a dispute between Abbath and Demonos over the rights to the band Immortal. So, yeah, and because there was all this legal stuff going on, Abbath just decided to just bow out of the band after a fallout with Demonos. And Abbath, as a result, would end up forming his solo band, and has done a few albums with that. And the band was essentially done, it seemed, in 2015. However, later in 2015, Demonos would revamp the band with only he and Horg at this point, as Apollyon basically went back to Art Noir after all this went down. So it would just be Demonos and Horg for a while, and then in 2018, 17 heading into 2018, they decide to get back into the studio, and Demonos back on guitars. So he seemed to have gotten better after the acute tendonitis he was diagnosed with, so he's back playing guitar, and he would take over on vocals. Peter Tatkerin, who came back to be the producer, would end up playing bass on this album. And released July 6th, 2018, we get Northern Chaos Gods. This was the album that got me more into Immortal when it came out, and it ends up as my number 6. I think this is an awesome comeback album after 9 years of dormancy. Demonos, while he may not be as great of a vocalist as Abath in my opinion, he is very good vocally on this album. And of course, this almost feels like an all-encompassing Immortal album. Like, you get songs that touch on different eras. Like, you get stuff that kind of sounds similar to Diabolical, Full Moon Mysticism, Battles in the North, At the Heart of Winter, Sons of Northern Darkness. It basically touches on all eras of the band. The title track that opens it, it's classic Immortal, awesome gallops. Into Battle Ride feels like a perfect mix of the heft of Sons of Northern Darkness with the melodies of At the Heart of Winter. So this song feels like the perfect bridge between both of those albums. But then you get to the duality of The Gates to Blashherk and Mighty Raven Dark. Almost feels like a continuation of the song Blashherk, Mighty Raven Dark off Battles in the North. Like, both songs have these big melodies and awesome riffs that kind of harken back to that song on Battles in the North. So it was almost like a story was being continued with these two songs, and both were done excellently. And of course, all the clean melodies. That's one of the big things that stood out to me about this album, were the clean melodies that were being performed. So, Demonos backfiring on all cylinders when it comes to guitars. Vocally may not be as strong as Abath, but still very good. This album ends up as my number 6. So, the band would trudge on a little bit longer, and then comes 2020, where there became another legal battle, this time between Demonos and Horde, basically fighting again over the rights to the name Immortal, and in the end, it's not owned by one person, it's owned by the whole band, which I don't know if Abath has a stake in this fight or whatever. So, yeah, it seemed like Immortal was done in 2020, and then 2022 comes around, and Demonos has got Immortal back up and running, and would return to the studio in 2023. And this would be the first album since Blizzard Beasts that you've had a different producer. Because from At the Heart of Winter through to Northern Chaos Gods, that was Peter Tatkerin. Here, you would get production help from Icedale from Enslaved, and he also would contribute bass and some guitars on here. And then you get a young drummer named Kevin Cavall, and released May 26th, 2023, we get the latest album, War Against All. I actually reviewed this album when it came out last year, and while it's still really good, this ends up being my number 8 Immortal album. It's just a competition got to them, but this is still a very damn good album, and I like how it actually kind of returns a little bit to the old days in terms of the production. Like, it's grittier, the guitar tone sounds a little meaner on this album. The only complaint I had with the production was the kick drum sounds small. But you do get some really cool tracks on here. Of course, the title track, Aggressive, Triplets and Chugs, War God. Kind of feels like another one of them all-encompassing Immortal songs. Like, it's a bit doomy, it's a little groove-oriented, melodic, there's great gallops. Nordlandier, however you say it, they're only instrumental thus far, and it's one of epic quality with somber melodies and even some cool bass melodies, like Icedale showcasing some nice bass skills on here when it comes down to incorporating melodies on the bass. And then Blashherk My Throne clean melodies, but with like a nice like Bathory triplet march. Almost feels like something straight out of the late 80s era Bathory, just done in 2023, which I thought was really fucking cool. But yeah, this album just falls down lower in the bottom third of the list because, well, it's only been out for a year and a half, and then also some of the songs did start to kind of go into a similar trope, which is all about the epicness, which nothing wrong with it, but with Immortal, I do like a good balance. And then, of course, the kick drum being the way it was, not the best. But still a very good, great album, I'll say, but it ends up being my number 8. And that, ladies and gentlemen, does it for my Immortal rankings. So yeah, wasn't a whole lot of albums to go over, but still, Immortal's legacy is of one of the most consistent black metal bands, dare I say metal bands of all time. And, well, their impact and influence on the entire genre can't be understated. After all, they were one of the few major Norwegian bands that didn't come from the Oslo scene that really made a huge impact. And of course, like, kind of showing to everyone who thought that, oh, black metalers hate death metal. You listen to this entire discography, there are death metal riffs all across this discography, which goes to show you that not all Norwegian black metal musicians hated death metal. These guys were big Morbid Angel guys. And they incorporated that, as well as some other bands, into what they did, but just play it through a black metal filter, which I absolutely love. And also, one of the reasons why this band, I think, gets a ton of love, they were more about riffs rather than atmosphere, which I certainly prefer for the most part. But yeah, Immortal, hopefully one day Demon Oz and Abath can reconcile and get back together and get back to the old Immortal the way that used to be and go from there, and we'll see what happens. Will that happen, though? Only time will tell. But as they say, time does heal all wounds. But ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for this video. What's your guys' favorite Immortal album? What are your rankings? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. However, before I go, I think it's time that I announce officially to you guys watching what are going to be the rankings I'm doing in 2025. Basically going to keep at the same pace that I did this year, and that's only 6 rankings a year, every 2 months. As far as what's going to be ranked in 2025, the next ranking that will be coming out in February is going to be Gojira. I've been really into Gojira for the past couple of years. I mean, I've always been a fan of theirs for years, but started to get into their early stuff, and I figured after what happened with them in the summertime this year, I think giving Gojira a fair shake at their catalog would be appropriate. Then in April, I'm going to be talking about Kreator. Gotta get to the other big thrash bands out there, and of course Kreator, one of the biggest thrash bands in the world, and one of my favorites. So even though I'm going to be dreading checking out some of their 90s work, I'm going to be looking forward to going back to some recent albums as well as some classics and talk about them more in depth. Then in June, I'm going to be talking Bloodbath. I have been wanting to do that ranking for years now, but you guys just kept voting it down. I'm putting my foot down here, people. I am finally going to rank Bloodbath. Whether it kills me or not is no other story. But yeah, I'm finally going to be talking about Bloodbath, one of the best supergroups of all time, and a great catalog. I can't wait to dive into that. This coming August, will be Nile. Another band I've wanted to rank for a long time, and now I'm finally going to do it because I put my foot down. Finally going to talk about arguably the greatest tech death band of all time. And then next October, I'm finally going to be touching on Overkill, and that's going to be the largest discography to talk about, 20 albums. So that ranking's going to get bloody for me, not only because of the amount of albums I have to listen to, but also where to rank them is going to be a whole nother story. And then next December, so the black metal one is going to be Shooter, one of my new recent favorite black metal bands. and I want to talk about their whole catalog, especially one album that's become one of my favorite black metal albums of all time. So yeah. So those are going to be the rankings I'm going to do next year. But until then, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.